Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland, to the forgotten chronicle of the children who chose darkness over light, earth over sky, and fear over freedom. Tonight, we descend into the depths of memory and stone to uncover the complete saga of the Slags, the pale ones who dwelt beneath the world's burning surface, whose story has been buried deeper than their underground homes. This is a tale of transformation through terror, of survival purchased with isolation, and of a people who became ghosts to avoid becoming corpses. So settle yourself comfortably in the darkness. Let your breathing slow like theirs once did in cavern stillness, and allow this forgotten history to wash over you like cool water from an underground lake, steady and eternal in the silence. The morning of October 23rd, 2077, found Marcus Chen checking his militia's emergency supplies one final time before the world ended forever. As a member of the Granite Peak Patriots, a secretive survivalist organization that had operated in the shadows of pre-war Nevada for nearly a decade, Chen understood better than most civilians that the international tensions crackling across radio waves and newspaper headlines were building towards something catastrophic and inevitable. The Patriots had formed during the Resource Wars, when America's annexation of Canada and the ongoing conflict with China made clear to certain prescient individuals that the old world was dying by degrees, hemorrhaging its lifeblood through endless warfare over dwindling supplies of oil, uranium, and basic necessities. Unlike the optimists who trusted in Vault-Tech's promise of underground salvation, or the fatalists who simply ignored the approaching storm, the Patriots had chosen a third path: self-reliance through preparation and community through shared purpose. Chen's group consisted of 47 adults and 31 children, families who had quietly relocated from across the western states to establish homesteads in the remote areas around Modoc, California. They were engineers and farmers, doctors and teachers, craftsmen and soldiers, people who possessed the skills necessary to rebuild civilization if civilization chose to destroy itself. Their leader, a former Army Corps of Engineers colonel named William Vergeer, had spent years identifying and preparing the cave system that would serve as their refuge when diplomacy finally failed and the bombs began to fall. The caves beneath Granite Peak had been formed over millennia by underground rivers that carved vast chambers and connecting passages through the limestone bedrock. Vergeer's geological surveys had confirmed that the system was extensive enough to house their entire community, deep enough to provide protection from radiation and blast effects, and blessed with a natural underground lake that would supply fresh water indefinitely. Most importantly, the caves could be sealed completely, cutting off all connection to the surface world until such time as it became safe to emerge. The Patriots had spent 3 years preparing their underground refuge, installing generators powered by geothermal energy, establishing hydroponic gardens fed by artificial lighting, and stockpiling enough food, medicine, and equipment to sustain nearly 80 people for decades if necessary. They had studied the mistakes of previous civilizations that had fallen to warfare and environmental catastrophe, learning from history to avoid repeating its tragedies. They believed they were ready for anything the dying world could inflict upon them, but no amount of preparation could ready the human heart for the psychological impact of watching everything you had ever known vanish in nuclear fire. Chen stood at the cave entrance as the electromagnetic pulse killed every electronic device within hundreds of miles, watching the distant flashes that marked the death of cities he had visited, the obliteration of landmarks he had known since childhood, the incineration of millions of people who had trusted their government to protect them from such horrors. The sealing ceremony that followed was conducted with the solemnity appropriate for a funeral, because that was essentially what it was. the funeral of the surface world and the birth of something entirely new. Vigir spoke briefly about necessity and survival, about the responsibility they bore to preserve human knowledge and values through the dark years ahead, about their duty to emerge someday as seeds of renewal in whatever world grew from the ashes of the old. Then the massive steel door was rolled into place and welded shut, cutting them off from contaminated air, radioactive fallout, and the screams of the dying world above. The first night in permanent darkness was perhaps the most psychologically challenging experience any of them had ever endured. Despite the electric lighting that illuminated the main chambers, the knowledge that they were sealed beneath tons of rock with no possibility of escape created claustrophobia that threatened to overwhelm even the most prepared individuals. Children cried for lost pets and abandoned toys. Adults wept for friends and family members who had refused to join their exodus from the surface, and everyone struggled with the magnitude of what they had given up in exchange for mere survival. Sleep came fitfully that first night, interrupted by nightmares of burial alive and visions of the surface world burning endlessly above their stone ceiling. The ventilation system that recycled their air created constant background noise that reminded them they were breathing artificially, sustained by machines rather than the natural atmosphere they had evolved to require. Even the water from their underground lake tasted different, mineral-heavy and slightly warm, lacking the familiar flavor of surface streams and municipal supplies. But human adaptability proved stronger than initial despair, and within days the Patriots had established routines that made their underground existence not just bearable but purposeful. Work crews maintained the machinery that kept them alive. Teachers established schools for the children using textbooks and materials they had preserved from the surface, and craftspeople began creating the tools and furnishings that would make their caves feel more like homes than bunkers. The hydroponic gardens became a source of particular pride and psychological comfort, providing not just food, but beauty in an environment that could easily become monotonous and depressing. Fresh vegetables and herbs supplemented their preserved rations, while flowering plants added color and fragrance that reminded them of the surface world they hoped someday to reclaim. The children especially loved tending the gardens, finding in the growing plants a connection to natural cycles that their sealed environment otherwise completely eliminated. Religious services took on new importance as the community struggled to find meaning and hope in their unprecedented circumstances. Vigir, despite his military background and scientific training, encouraged the various faith traditions represented among the Patriots, understanding that spiritual resources would prove as essential as material ones during their extended isolation. Prayer circles and meditation sessions provided structure for grief and anxiety while reinforcing the social bonds that held their community together through its most vulnerable period. The education of the children became the community's primary long-term project, since these young people would be the ones to eventually emerge and rebuild whatever remained of human civilization. The Patriots possessed an extensive library of technical manuals, historical texts, and cultural materials that represented the accumulated knowledge of pre-war society. Teaching these children to read, write, calculate, and think critically would ensure that valuable information survived even if all physical artifacts were eventually lost or destroyed. But perhaps most importantly, the children needed to learn the skills of underground survival that their parents were developing through trial and error, how to maintain the delicate balance of their closed ecosystem, how to repair the machinery that sustained their lives, how to cultivate food in artificial environments, and how to work together harmoniously in confined spaces where personality conflicts could prove literally fatal. These lessons could not be found in any pre-war textbook but had to be discovered through experience and transmitted through example. The psychological challenges of permanent enclosure, manifested in different ways among different individuals, requiring community leaders to develop new approaches to mental health and social harmony. Some people became withdrawn and depressive, spending long hours in their private chambers and avoiding communal activities. Others became hyperactive and anxious, unable to relax in the enclosed environment and constantly seeking tasks or conversations to distract them from their circumstances. A few became genuinely claustrophobic and required medication to prevent panic attacks that could disrupt the entire community's peace of mind. Children adapted more quickly than adults to their underground existence, their natural flexibility and shorter memories, enabling them to accept their new world without the constant comparisons to surface life that tormented their parents. Within months, the youngest children spoke of their cave homes with the same casual familiarity that previous generations had used for houses with yards and windows. They played games adapted to underground spaces, created art from cave formations and artificial lighting, and developed friendships that seemed unaffected by the extraordinary circumstances of their shared isolation. The community's first deaths were perhaps the most traumatic experiences of their early underground years, forcing them to confront mortality in an environment where traditional burial practices were impossible. When elderly Margaret Hoffman died of a heart attack 6 months after the sealing, the Patriots faced the necessity of developing new funeral rites appropriate to their unique circumstances. They created a memorial chamber where cremated remains could be interred alongside personal belongings and written remembrances, establishing traditions that would serve future generations of underground dwellers. Food production gradually evolved from simple preservation of pre-war supplies to sophisticated cultivation techniques that maximize nutritional value while minimizing resource consumption. The underground lake provided not only drinking water, but irrigation for expanded hydroponic systems that eventually produced enough fresh food to support their entire population. Mushroom cultivation proved particularly successful in the cave environment, providing protein and variety that supplemented their more basic food supplies, while requiring minimal energy and space. The first year underground passed with surprising rapidity as the Patriots established the rhythms and routines that would define their new way of life. Work shifts were organized to maintain essential systems, educational programs were developed to preserve and transmit knowledge, and recreational activities were created to maintain morale and social cohesion. By the first anniversary of the sealing, many community members had begun to think of their cave system not as a temporary refuge, but as a permanent home that might shelter multiple generations. But the most significant change during that first year was the gradual physical adaptation that began to occur among all the underground dwellers, though it was most pronounced in the children whose growing bodies proved most responsive to their altered environment. The complete absence of natural sunlight began to affect their skin pigmentation, causing the gradual fading of normal coloration toward the pale, almost translucent appearance that would eventually characterize all long-term cave dwellers. Their eyes, constantly adjusting to artificial lighting and stone-filtered illumination, began to show the enlarged pupils and increased sensitivity that would make surface life so challenging for future generations. These physical changes were initially subtle enough to be dismissed as temporary effects of stress and altered diet, but careful medical monitoring by the community's doctors revealed that they were actually adaptive responses to the underground environment. The pale skin reduced the body's production of melanin in response to the absence of harmful ultraviolet radiation, while the enlarged pupils maximized light-gathering ability in the dimmer conditions of artificial illumination. Both changes improved the settlers' comfort and effectiveness in their new environment, while simultaneously making them less suited to eventual return to surface conditions. The community's social structure evolved during this period from the military-style organization that had characterized their initial survival phase to a more democratic and civilian approach that emphasized consensus building and shared responsibility. Vigier remained the acknowledged leader, But his authority became more consultative and less directive, as the immediate crisis of survival gave way to the long-term challenge of building a sustainable underground civilization. Marriage and family relationships took on new significance in the closed community, where personal compatibility became literally a matter of survival for everyone involved. The Patriots developed new courtship customs and marriage ceremonies adapted to their unique circumstances, emphasizing psychological compatibility and commitment to community welfare, alongside traditional romantic considerations. Children born in the caves would be citizens of an entirely new world, and their parents bore special responsibility for ensuring they grew up with the skills and values necessary to thrive in whatever environment they might eventually inherit. The second year brought the first births of true underground children, babies who had never breathed surface air or seen natural sunlight, whose entire existence was bounded by stone walls and artificial lighting. These children represented both hope for the community's future and anxiety about their eventual adaptation to surface conditions that seemed increasingly remote and uncertain. Would children raised in permanent enclosure be psychologically capable of handling the vast open spaces of the surface world? Would their physical adaptations to underground life prove permanent and perhaps even hereditary? As the seasons passed unmarked in their timeless underground environment, the Patriots began to lose track of surface time and develop their own calendar based on internal community events rather than astronomical observations. Birthdays and anniversaries became more significant as markers of passing time, while holidays took on new meanings adapted to their unique circumstances. Christmas became a celebration of light and community in the darkness, while New Year marked their survival for another cycle of seasons they could no longer directly observe. The third year saw the first serious discussions about eventual return to the surface world, as radiation detectors and air filtration systems began to indicate that contamination levels might be decreasing to potentially survivable ranges. But these discussions revealed fundamental differences of opinion within the community about whether surface return was desirable or even necessary. Many Patriots had become so adapted to underground life that they viewed their cave system as superior to any surface environment, offering security and stability that the devastated outer world could never provide. The children, in particular, showed little interest in or enthusiasm for the surface world their parents described in increasingly nostalgic terms. To them, the caves were not a refuge but simply home, the natural environment where human beings lived and worked and raised their families. The idea of leaving their secure, familiar underground world to venture into the dangerous and uncertain surface seemed not like liberation, but like exile from everything they had ever known and loved. The fourth year brought the first major expansion of the cave system, as the community's growing population and increasing comfort with their environment led to exploration and development of previously unused chambers and passages. These expansions revealed the true extent of their underground domain, with vast areas suitable for agriculture, manufacturing, and residential development that could potentially support a much larger population than their current 78 residents. The discovery of additional underground water sources during these explorations provided the final proof that their cave system could sustain a permanent civilization rather than merely serving as a temporary refuge. The Patriots began to think in terms of centuries rather than years, planning for the education of grandchildren who might never see the surface world, and great-grandchildren who would consider the caves their ancestral homeland rather than an emergency shelter. By the fifth year, the physical changes that had begun subtly in all the underground dwellers had become pronounced enough to raise serious questions about their eventual ability to return to surface life. The children showed the most dramatic adaptations. Skin so pale, It seemed almost luminescent in artificial light, eyes so enlarged and sensitive that normal illumination caused them pain and discomfort. Even the adults had changed significantly, their bodies adapting to the consistent temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure of their underground environment in ways that would make surface conditions genuinely challenging rather than merely unfamiliar. The psychological adaptations were equally profound but less visible to casual observation. The community had developed social customs and behavioral patterns perfectly suited to life in confined spaces with limited privacy and constant interpersonal contact. Conflict resolution, resource sharing, and decision-making had all evolved to meet the unique requirements of their closed society, but these same adaptations might prove problematic in the more individualistic and competitive environment of surface communities. As the 10th anniversary of the sealing approached, the Patriots faced the reality that they had become something entirely new, not surface dwellers temporarily sheltering underground, but genuine cave dwellers whose bodies, minds, and culture had adapted to subterranean life in ways that might prove irreversible. They were still human, but they were human in a way that no previous generation had ever been, shaped by environment and necessity into something their ancestors could never have imagined. The stage was set for the next phase of their evolution, when growing population and changing circumstances would force them to confront the surface world they had abandoned so long ago. The children born in the 20th year of the sealing were the first generation to know only darkness as their natural state, their tiny bodies emerging into a world of stone and shadow that their parents still thought of as temporary refuge, but which represented the only reality these young souls would ever understand. Little Sarah Kellerman drew her first breath in air that had never touched the surface, her lungs filling with the recycled atmosphere of the deep caves, while her eyes opened to see only the gentle glow of artificial lighting that had replaced the sun. Her grandparents remembered with increasing vagueness. Sarah's skin was pale beyond anything the surface world had ever produced, translucent enough that the blue tracery of her veins showed clearly beneath the surface, giving her an ethereal quality that seemed almost supernatural to the older residents, who remembered when human beings had been various shades of brown and pink and olive. Her eyes, when they finally focused on the world around her, were enormous pools of darkness, with pupils so enlarged that her irises appeared as mere thin rings of color around vast black centers that seemed to drink in every photon of available light. The children of Sarah's generation developed differently from their parents in ways that went far beyond simple physical appearance, their nervous systems and sensory organs adapting to the underground environment with a plasticity that adult brains could no longer achieve. They could navigate the cave system in near total darkness, their enhanced night vision enabling them to see clearly in conditions that left their elders stumbling and disoriented. Their hearing became acute enough to detect the subtle sounds that indicated changes in air pressure, water flow, or structural integrity, making them natural guardians of the community's safety and security. But perhaps most remarkably, the cave-born children seemed to develop an almost mystical connection to the underground environment itself, reading the moods and rhythms of the stone world with intuitive understanding that their parents had to learn through years of careful observation and scientific study. They could predict when sections of the cave system would flood during heavy rains on the surface, sense the approach of minor earthquakes through vibrations that registered below the threshold of adult awareness, and locate new water sources by following subtle air currents that carried the scent of hidden springs. The community's educational programs evolved to accommodate these unique capabilities, while ensuring that the children still received the broad liberal education that their parents considered essential for eventual return to surface civilization. The cave-born learned to read and write by the light of phosphorescent fungi that their parents had discovered growing in the deepest chambers. Their enhanced vision, making such dim illumination perfectly adequate for academic work that would have been impossible for surface-adapted eyes. Mathematics took on new meaning in a world where precise calculation could mean the difference between life and death, where miscalculating the flow rate of their underground lake or the power consumption of their artificial lighting could result in shortages that threatened the entire community. The children learned to perform complex calculations in their heads while moving through the cave system, developing mental math skills that far exceeded what most surface schools had ever produced. Science education focused heavily on geology, biology, and engineering, the disciplines most relevant to their underground existence. But the children also learned physics through the unique phenomena of their cave environment, studying acoustics in chambers with perfect natural reverb, observing thermodynamics in the geothermal systems that powered their community, and exploring chemistry through the mineral formations that surrounded them on all sides. History lessons took on an almost mythological quality as the children learned about the surface world their parents had abandoned, civilizations and cultures that seemed as remote and fantastic as ancient Greece or Rome had once seemed to pre-war students. The children listened with polite interest to stories about automobiles and airplanes, about cities with millions of inhabitants and countries that spanned entire continents. But these tales held no more immediate relevance to their daily lives than fairy stories about dragons and magic kingdoms. The development of a distinct underground culture became evident as the cave-born children created their own games, songs, and stories that reflected their unique environment and experiences. They played hide and seek in absolute darkness, developing games that required no light whatsoever, while building skills that were essential for survival in their underground world. Their songs echoed through the cave chambers with haunting melodies that seemed to emerge from the stone itself, creating music that was beautiful but utterly unlike anything ever composed on the surface. The stories the children told each other were populated by creatures of stone and shadow, heroes who could see in perfect darkness, and villains who brought harmful light to disturb the peaceful depths. The surface world, when it appeared in their stories at all, was portrayed as a hostile realm of burning brightness and endless sky where unwary cave dwellers might fall upward into the blue void, never to return to the safety of their stone home. Religious and spiritual practices among the cave-born evolved toward veneration of the earth itself, developing a form of worship that honored the caves as a living entity that sheltered and nurtured its human children. They created shrines in natural alcoves, decorated with beautiful mineral formations, where they left offerings of food and flowers grown in their hydroponic gardens, while expressing gratitude for the protection and sustenance their underground world provided. The traditional surface religions practiced by their parents seemed increasingly irrelevant to children who had never seen the sky or experienced weather, whose understanding of seasonal cycles came only from the artificial calendar maintained by the community elders. Christmas lost its connection to the winter solstice and became simply a celebration of light in darkness, while Easter transformed from a spring festival into a commemoration of renewal and growth in their eternal underground garden. Marriage customs among the cave-born reflected their unique social environment, where privacy was limited and community harmony was essential for survival. Courtship became a subtle art of quiet conversation in the deep chambers, where young people could speak privately while remaining within the safe boundaries of their communal world. Wedding ceremonies took place in the largest of the natural chambers, with the entire community gathered to witness and approve unions that would add to their underground civilization. The children born to these cave-adapted couples showed even more pronounced physical modifications than their parents. Their bodies, shaped by generations of underground life, into forms that seemed almost designed for their subterranean environment. Their bones were lighter and more flexible, adapted to navigating narrow passages and climbing the irregular surfaces of natural rock formations. Their cardiovascular systems were more efficient at processing the recycled air of their closed environment, while their digestive systems had adapted to the limited diet available in their underground world. But the most significant adaptation was psychological rather than physical, as the children developed a form of consciousness that was perfectly suited to their enclosed world, while becoming increasingly incompatible with the vast open spaces of the surface. The concept of unlimited space was literally incomprehensible to minds that had developed within the safe boundaries of stone walls and chamber ceilings. The idea of emptiness extending infinitely in all directions created a form of existential terror that was impossible for surface dwellers to understand. When the community's explorers discovered new passages leading deeper into the earth, the cave-born children volunteered eagerly for expeditions that would have terrified their parents. Their enhanced senses and intuitive understanding of underground environments, making them ideal scouts for mapping unknown territories. They returned from these explorations with reports of vast chambers and underground rivers that extended far beyond the community's current boundaries, describing a hidden world of incredible beauty and complexity that existed entirely separate from the surface realm. The discovery of other life forms, adapted to the deep cave environment, fascinated the children and provided them with a sense of kinship that their parents could never fully understand. Blind fish in the underground pools, albino insects that had never seen sunlight, and varieties of fungi that created their own bioluminescent illumination, all seemed like fellow citizens of the underground realm, rather than mere curiosities to be studied and catalogued. The children learned to cultivate some of these native species, developing agricultural techniques that supplemented their artificial food production with resources that the cave system provided naturally. Mushroom gardens expanded far beyond their original hydroponic plots, while pools of blind fish provided protein that required no external inputs beyond the cave's own ecosystem. The community gradually became less dependent on pre-war technology and more integrated with the natural systems that had sustained the deep earth for millennia. Language itself evolved among the cave-born, developing new vocabularies to describe sensations and experiences that had no equivalent in surface speech. They created words for different qualities of darkness, distinguishing between the soft blackness of deep chambers and the sharp darkness of narrow passages, between the welcoming darkness of home and the uncertain darkness of unexplored territories. They developed elaborate terminology for describing textures that could only be perceived through touch, since so much of their world was experienced through senses other than sight. The concept of time changed fundamentally for children who never experienced the natural cycles of day and night, seasons and weather that had regulated human consciousness since the species first evolved. They developed internal chronometers based on the rhythms of their underground community, meal times and work shifts, sleep cycles and recreational periods, creating a human-scaled temporality that had no connection to the astronomical cycles that govern surface life. Dreams among the cave-born often featured impossible landscapes of infinite caverns and underground oceans, vast subterranean cities populated by pale people who lived in harmony with the living stone. These dreams seemed to represent not fantasy but aspiration, visions of what their underground world might become if their community continued to grow and develop its unique civilization. The older children began to express interest in expanding beyond their current cave system, not toward the surface world. Their parents remembered but deeper into the earth, where they might discover or create larger communities of underground dwellers. They spoke of sending expeditions to find other cave systems that might house other survivors, creating networks of underground cities connected by passages that would never need to open to the hostile surface world. The 40th year of the sealing brought the first serious discussions among the cave-born about whether their parents' dream of eventual surface return was desirable or even possible for people who had become so thoroughly adapted to underground life. The physical changes that made them supremely suited to their cave environment simultaneously made them vulnerable to surface conditions that their parents might eventually be able to tolerate. The enlarged pupils that gave them superior vision in dim conditions would be painfully sensitive to natural sunlight, while their pale skin would provide no protection against ultraviolet radiation that could cause serious burns within minutes of exposure. Their respiratory systems, perfectly adapted to the consistent atmosphere of their closed environment, might struggle with surface air that contained pollutants and allergens their immune systems had never encountered. More fundamentally, the psychological adaptations that made them comfortable in enclosed spaces would create severe anxiety and disorientation in the unlimited vistas of the surface world. The safety and security they found in stone walls and chamber ceilings would be replaced by the terrifying emptiness of open sky, creating conditions that might prove literally unbearable for minds that had developed within the protective boundaries of their underground home. The community's population had grown to nearly 200 individuals by this time, straining the capacity of their original cave system while demonstrating the viability of their underground civilization. The success of their isolated society proved that human beings could adapt to almost any environment, developing new forms of culture and consciousness that were perfectly suited to their unique circumstances while remaining recognizably human in their essential characteristics. But this success also created new challenges as the community faced the question of whether their underground paradise could sustain continued growth or whether they would eventually be forced to seek additional living space, either deeper in the earth or, terrifyingly, on the contaminated surface that their parents had fled so long ago. The children who had never known sunlight prepared to make decisions that would determine whether their unique civilization would continue to flourish in the depths or be forced to confront the alien world of sky and weather that waited beyond their stone ceiling. The stage was set for the next phase of their remarkable story when population pressure and resource limitations would force even the most cave-adapted individuals to consider the unthinkable, opening their sealed world to whatever remained of the surface realm they had abandoned before their birth. The children of the deep earth stood at the threshold of a decision that would define not just their own futures, but the fate of the extraordinary civilization they had created in humanity's forgotten depths. The morning that would transform the underground community forever began like countless others in the depths of the earth, with the artificial dawn of electric lighting gradually illuminating chambers that had known no natural sunrise for over 4 decades. But William Vergeer III, grandson of the original patriarch and now leader of their growing civilization, woke with the weight of an impossible decision pressing against his consciousness like the tons of stone that sheltered their world from the poisoned surface above. The population had swelled to 237 souls, filling every available chamber and passage in their original cave system while straining the resources that had once seemed inexhaustible. The underground lake that had sustained them through 4 decades was showing signs of depletion, its water level dropping steadily as their expanding hydroponic gardens and growing population drew from reserves that nature had taken millennia to accumulate. The air recycling systems, maintained and repaired countless times by their skilled engineers, were operating at maximum capacity, while showing signs of age that even the most creative maintenance could not indefinitely postpone. But most pressingly, the psychological stress of overcrowding was creating tensions that threatened the harmony their community had maintained since the original sealing. Privacy had become a luxury that fewer and fewer residents could enjoy, while the constant presence of neighbors created friction that their conflict resolution systems struggled to manage. Children born in recent years showed signs of developmental problems that their medical staff attributed to the stress of extreme population density, while adults exhibited increasing rates of depression and anxiety that suggested their closed society had reached the limits of sustainable growth. Vegir stood in the central chamber where his grandfather had first addressed the original settlers, looking out at faces that showed the unmistakable signs of their underground adaptation. Skin so pale it seemed to glow in the artificial light, eyes enlarged to capture every photon in their dimly lit world. Bodies, shaped by generations of life, in confined spaces, where every movement had to be calculated and controlled. These were his people, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those brave souls who had chosen survival over comfort, isolation over integration, safety over freedom. The decision he faced was not simply practical but philosophical, touching the very foundations of their underground civilization and challenging assumptions that had guided their community since its founding. For over 40 years, they had justified their isolation as temporary necessity, maintaining the fiction that they were surface dwellers temporarily sheltering underground, rather than cave dwellers who had evolved beyond their origins. The prospect of opening their sealed world forced them to confront the reality of what they had become and what they might choose to remain. The exploration teams that Vegir had authorized to map the deeper cave systems had returned with reports that offered both hope and trepidation. Vast chambers extended far beyond their current boundaries, carved by ancient rivers and connected by passages that could potentially house thousands of residents in comfort and privacy. Underground rivers flowed through territories that had never been touched by human presence, carrying clean water that could sustain their civilization for centuries without depletion. The deep earth held spaces beautiful and terrible, cathedral-like chambers where sound echoed for minutes and narrow passages that required crawling through gaps barely wide enough for human bodies. But these deeper territories were also more challenging and dangerous than their current home, requiring technical expertise and physical courage that would stretch their community's capabilities to the breaking point. Some passages were partially flooded, requiring underwater navigation that could prove fatal to the inexperienced. Others were unstable, showing signs of recent collapse that suggested the constant possibility of cave-ins that could trap or kill unwary explorers. The deeper chambers were beautiful but alien, shaped by geological forces that had no concern for human comfort or safety. The alternative that no one wanted to discuss but everyone understood was the possibility of returning to the surface world their grandparents had abandoned in nuclear fire and radioactive ash. 4 decades had passed since the Great War, long enough for radiation levels to decrease substantially from their initial lethal peaks. Their instruments suggested that surface exposure might now be survivable, though certainly not comfortable for people whose bodies had adapted so completely to their underground environment. The surface world represented both opportunity and terror for the cave-born generations who comprised the majority of their population. Unlimited space for expansion, abundant resources that required no recycling or careful conservation, and the possibility of contact with other human communities that might have survived the post-war period in different ways. But surface life would also mean abandoning the security and stability that had defined their existence, exposing themselves to weather and radiation, and the 1,000 dangers of an environment that remained fundamentally hostile to human life. Vegir's own feelings about surface return were complicated by memories that were not quite his own. Inherited recollections of sunlight and wind and open sky that his grandfather had passed down through stories that seemed more like fairy tales than descriptions of actual experience. He had dreamed sometimes of blue vastness overhead and green growing things that drew their power directly from the burning star that ruled the day. But these dreams felt like fantasies rather than memories, beautiful impossibilities that had no connection to the stone reality of his actual world. The community meetings that preceded the final decision were, unlike anything in their previous history, bringing together perspectives and experiences that had never before needed reconciliation. The oldest residents, those few who still retained personal memories of surface life, spoke with nostalgia about freedoms and beauties that the younger generations could barely comprehend. The middle generations, who had been children during the sealing but retained some connection to their surface origins, were torn between loyalty to their underground home and curiosity about the world their parents had described. But it was the youngest generations, those born entirely in the caves, whose voices ultimately proved most influential in the community's deliberations. They spoke with passionate conviction about their right to remain in the only world they had ever known, to continue developing the underground civilization that was their birthright and their gift to future humanity. They had no desire to abandon stone walls for open sky, recycled air for unfiltered atmosphere, careful conservation for wasteful abundance. The cave-born children presented their own proposal for addressing the population crisis, suggesting organized expeditions to establish daughter communities in the deeper cave systems their scouts had discovered. They envisioned a network of underground cities connected by passages and communication systems, a vast subterranean civilization that could house millions of people without ever needing to expose them to the dangers and discomforts of surface existence. Their plan was ambitious and appealing, offering growth without abandonment, expansion without exposure, progress without surrender of the principles that had sustained their community through 4 decades of isolation. But it was also dangerous and uncertain, requiring resources and expertise that their community possessed only in limited quantities. The establishment of new settlements would divide their population at a time when their current home was already straining to support them, while the technical challenges of expanding into unknown territories could prove beyond their current capabilities. The debate that followed lasted for weeks, touching every aspect of their community's identity and values, while forcing residents to examine assumptions they had never before questioned. Were they surface dwellers temporarily sheltering underground? Or had they become something new that deserved recognition as a legitimate form of human civilization? Did they owe loyalty to the memory of the surface world their ancestors had known? Or could they embrace their underground adaptation as evolution rather than deviation? The psychological dimension of their decision proved as complex as the practical considerations, since any choice they made would have profound implications for their community's mental health and social cohesion. Those who remained underground would need to accept that they were choosing permanent isolation from the broader human community, while those who ventured to the surface would face psychological challenges that might prove overwhelming for minds shaped by enclosed spaces and controlled environments. The medical staff provided sobering assessments of what surface exposure would mean for their physically adapted population. The enlarged pupils that gave them superior vision in their dimly lit caves would be painfully sensitive to natural sunlight, requiring protective eyewear and gradual adjustment periods that might take months or years. Their pale skin would provide no protection against ultraviolet radiation, making sun exposure potentially life-threatening without careful precautions and protective clothing. More troubling were the respiratory challenges they would face in surface air that contained pollutants, allergens, and microorganisms their isolated immune systems had never encountered. The recycled atmosphere of their closed community had protected them from many diseases and contaminants. But this protection had come at the cost of reduced immune system diversity that could make them vulnerable to surface pathogens that posed no threat to naturally adapted humans. The psychological challenges were even more daunting than the physical ones, since their minds had been shaped by 40 years of life in enclosed spaces, where safety meant walls and ceilings, rather than endless emptiness. The cave-born had developed a form of reverse claustrophobia, a terror of open spaces that made them feel vulnerable and exposed when removed from the protective boundaries of their stone environment. Surface life would require overcoming this psychological adaptation while learning to function in an environment that their deepest instincts identified as dangerous and wrong. As autumn arrived unmarked in their timeless underground world, Vigir made the decision that would define their community's future and challenge everything they believed about human adaptation and survival. The seal would be broken not because their underground world had failed them, but because it had succeeded too well, creating a population that had outgrown its original boundaries, while developing capabilities and perspectives that deserved the chance to flourish and expand. The ceremony of breaking was planned with the same solemnity that had marked the original sealing, recognizing that they were ending one phase of their civilization while beginning another that would test their courage, wisdom, and unity in ways they could not yet imagine. The massive steel door that had protected them for over 4 decades would be cut away, allowing contaminated surface air to mix with their carefully controlled atmosphere for the first time since their ancestors had fled the burning world above. The technical preparations for surface exposure required months of planning and resource allocation, as their engineers developed protective equipment and medical protocols that might enable their adapted population to survive in conditions their bodies were not designed to handle. Radiation detectors would monitor exposure levels while medical teams stood ready to treat the burns, respiratory problems, and psychological trauma that surface contact would almost certainly produce. But the most important preparations were psychological rather than technical, as community leaders worked to prepare their people for experiences that had no precedent in their underground existence. How do you describe sunlight to people who have never seen natural illumination? How do you explain wind to people whose air has never moved freely? How do you prepare minds shaped by enclosed spaces for the terrifying vastness of open sky? The morning chosen for their emergence was clear and cold, with cloud cover that would reduce the intensity of sunlight while still allowing their first glimpse of the surface world their grandparents had abandoned. The small advance party that would make initial contact consisted of volunteers who understood they were risking their lives to determine whether their community's survival lay in continued isolation or dangerous integration with whatever remained of surface civilization. Vigir himself would lead the expedition, carrying the hopes and fears of 237 souls, whose futures depended on what they discovered beyond the steel barrier that had defined the limits of their world for longer than most of them had been alive. As the cutting torches began their work on the great door, he felt the weight of history settling over their community like stone dust, marking the end of their age of innocence and the beginning of their confrontation with the vast, dangerous, beautiful world that waited beyond the safety of their underground home. The first breath of surface air that entered their caves in over 40 years carried scents and sensations that were both alien and somehow familiar, triggering genetic memories of wind and weather that their bodies had never forgotten. Even as their minds struggled to process experiences beyond their underground comprehension, the seal was broken at last, and with it the certainty that had sustained them through 4 decades of isolation. Whatever came next would require courage they had never needed to summon and wisdom they had never been forced to develop. as the children of the deep earth prepared to confront the surface world that had shaped their ancestors, while remaining forever foreign to their own adapted consciousness. The first steps into sunlight were agony beyond anything the cave dwellers had ever experienced, their enlarged pupils contracting violently against illumination that felt like molten metal poured directly into their brains, while their pale skin began to burn within seconds of exposure to ultraviolet radiation that their ancestors had once taken for granted. Vigir stumbled backward toward the cave entrance, his hands pressed against eyes that streamed tears, in a desperate attempt to flush out the overwhelming brightness, while his companions huddled against the stone walls that had sheltered them for so many decades. The protective equipment their engineers had designed proved woefully inadequate against the reality of surface conditions, their improvised sunglasses and clothing offering minimal protection against an environment that seemed actively hostile to their adapted physiology. Even the filtered sunlight of an overcast winter morning was more than their light-sensitive vision could process, creating a world of painful glare and indistinct shapes that bore no resemblance to the detailed mental pictures they had constructed from their grandparents' descriptions. But it was the sky itself that proved most psychologically devastating to minds that had developed within the safe boundaries of stone chambers and passage ceilings. The endless blue-grey emptiness that stretched infinitely overhead triggered a form of vertigo that had no name in their underground vocabulary, creating the terrifying sensation that they might fall upward into that vast nothingness, tumbling forever through empty space with no walls or ceiling to arrest their helpless plunge into the void. The wind was another shock that their enclosed world had never prepared them to experience, moving air that carried scents and sounds from vast distances, while creating pressure changes that made their adapted inner ears ache and ring with phantom sounds. The cave dwellers had learned to interpret every subtle air current within their controlled environment. But surface wind was chaos incarnate, carrying information overload that overwhelmed senses evolved for the predictable atmospheric conditions of their sealed community. The first expedition lasted less than an hour before the psychological and physical stress forced them to retreat to the familiar safety of their underground home. But those minutes of surface exposure had revealed both the magnitude of their adaptation challenge and the unexpected beauty that waited beyond their stone ceiling. Despite the pain and terror of their initial contact with sunlight and sky, they had glimpsed a world of incredible richness and complexity that stirred emotions they had no words to describe. The debriefing sessions that followed their first surface expedition revealed the profound impact that even brief exposure had created in their understanding of human existence and possibility. The concept of unlimited space, which had been merely theoretical during their underground years, became viscerally real in ways that challenged their fundamental assumptions about safety, security, and the proper relationship between consciousness and environment. The younger cave dwellers, those born entirely within their sealed community, struggled most with integrating their surface experience into worldviews that had been shaped by enclosed spaces and controlled conditions. The sensation of falling upward into the sky created recurring nightmares that disrupted their sleep for weeks after the expedition, while the memory of unfiltered sunlight left them hypersensitive to even the dimmed artificial lighting of their cave chambers. But gradually, through careful conditioning and repeated brief exposures, the more adaptable members of their community began to develop tolerance for surface conditions that would have been unimaginable during their first terrifying encounter with the outer world. They learned to wear multiple layers of protective clothing that covered every inch of exposed skin, while specially designed eyewear reduced the painful glare of natural light to levels their adapted vision could process without immediate damage. The development of surface tolerance became a community project that engaged their best minds in solving problems that had never before existed in human history. How do you prepare people for experiences that their biology actively rejects? How do you overcome psychological adaptations that have been reinforced by decades of survival in radically different conditions? How do you bridge the gap between two forms of human existence that seem fundamentally incompatible? The answer emerged through small steps and careful experimentation, beginning with protected observation periods that allowed them to study surface conditions without full exposure to their overwhelming intensity. They constructed viewing chambers near the cave entrance that filtered light and provided enclosed spaces where cave dwellers could observe the outer world without experiencing the psychological terror of unlimited space. These protected observations revealed a surface world that was both more damaged and more recovered than their instruments had suggested, scarred by nuclear devastation but showing signs of natural healing that offered hope for eventual human rehabilitation. The landscape around their cave system showed the typical signs of post-war ecological disruption: mutated vegetation, contaminated soil, and animal species that had been transformed by 4 decades of radiation exposure. But it also displayed the resilience of life systems that refused to be permanently destroyed by human folly. The decision to establish a surface presence was motivated not by desire but by necessity, as their underground population continued to strain the carrying capacity of their cave system, while their exploration of deeper territories proved more challenging and dangerous than anticipated. Surface expansion offered the possibility of immediate relief from overcrowding while providing access to resources that their closed system could no longer supply in adequate quantities. The first surface structures were built with materials salvaged from the ruins of pre-war civilization, combined with resources they had manufactured during their decades of underground isolation. These buildings were unlike anything that had existed before the war, designed specifically for people whose physiology had been shaped by cave dwelling, while providing protection against the environmental hazards that still characterized the post-war surface world. The architecture reflected their unique needs and limitations, featuring small windows that could be heavily filtered or completely blocked, thick walls that provided psychological security for minds accustomed to stone barriers, and multiple underground connections that allowed residents to retreat to their original cave system whenever surface conditions became unbearable. These structures were not houses in any traditional sense, but hybrid spaces that bridged the gap between underground and surface existence. The first permanent surface residents were volunteers who understood they were pioneers in a form of human existence that had never before been attempted. People willing to sacrifice the comfort and security of their cave home to establish the forward positions that might enable their community's eventual expansion and survival. These brave souls endured daily physical discomfort and psychological stress, while learning to function in an environment that their deepest instincts identified as dangerous and wrong. The agricultural experiments that accompanied their surface expansion proved more successful than anyone had dared to hope, revealing that their years of hydroponic cultivation had given them skills that translated remarkably well to surface farming under post-war conditions. The contaminated soil could be treated and improved using techniques they had developed for growing food in the sterile environment of their cave system, while their careful resource management practices enabled them to achieve yields that seemed miraculous to anyone familiar with typical post-war agricultural struggles. The water management systems they constructed represented perhaps their greatest achievement, combining their expertise in closed-loop resource cycling with the opportunities presented by surface water sources that had been cleansed by 40 years of natural filtration and purification. They created irrigation networks that conserved every drop, while providing redundant backup systems that could sustain their crops, even during extended periods of drought or contamination. The first harvest from their surface farms provided not just material sustenance, but psychological validation for their decision to break the seal and venture into the hostile outer world. The vegetables and grains they grew were larger and more nutritious than anything they had produced in their hydroponic gardens, while the abundance of their yield suggested that surface agriculture could support a much larger population than their underground systems had ever sustained. But success in surface farming came at a price that was measured not just in physical discomfort, but in psychological adaptation that fundamentally changed the character of their community. The people who worked the surface fields began to develop different perspectives and priorities from those who remained in the caves, creating the first serious divisions in their previously unified society. The surface workers gradually became more tolerant of light and open spaces, their physiology adapting slowly to conditions that had initially seemed unbearable, while their psychology developed new frameworks for understanding safety, security, and proper human existence. They began to speak of the cave system as their shelter rather than their home, viewing the underground chambers as refuge spaces rather than the proper environment for human consciousness. Meanwhile, those who remained primarily underground maintained their traditional perspectives and values, viewing the surface world as an unfortunate necessity rather than a desirable expansion of human possibility. They worried that their community was abandoning the principles and adaptations that had enabled their survival, trading the security of their cave home for the false promises of a surface world that remained fundamentally hostile to human life. The psychological tensions created by this division required new forms of community governance and conflict resolution, as their traditional consensus-building processes proved inadequate for bridging the gap between surface and underground perspectives. They developed formal systems for rotating between surface and cave assignments, ensuring that no one became so adapted to either environment that they lost connection with the other half of their community. The seasonal patterns of their surface operations reflected both practical necessities and psychological limitations, with the intensity of summer sunlight making surface work unbearable for their adapted physiology, while winter conditions provided relief that enabled extended periods of outdoor activity. They learned to plan their agricultural cycles around these constraints, developing crop varieties that could be planted and harvested during the periods when their workers could function effectively in surface conditions. The storage systems they constructed were marvels of engineering that reflected decades of experience with resource conservation and management, providing controlled environments where surface produce could be preserved for consumption during periods when outdoor work was impossible. These facilities bridged the gap between their surface and underground operations while ensuring that seasonal variations in productivity did not threaten their community's food security. The first winter of surface operations proved particularly challenging, as their adapted physiology struggled with temperature variations that their controlled cave environment had never included in their experience. They discovered that their bodies had lost much of their natural ability to regulate temperature, having evolved to function in the consistent conditions of their underground home, where seasonal changes were marked only by artificial calendars rather than actual environmental shifts. But spring brought renewed hope and expanded possibilities, as their surface installations proved their worth through sustained productivity and gradual improvement in their workers' adaptation to outdoor conditions. The people who had spent the winter months learning to function in variable temperatures and changing light conditions emerged with capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to their cave-bound relatives, able to work effectively in conditions that had initially seemed unbearable. The second year of surface operations saw the establishment of permanent above-ground residences for those community members who had developed sufficient tolerance for outdoor conditions to live outside the cave system on a regular basis. These pioneers maintained connections to their underground home, but began to develop lifestyles and perspectives that reflected their growing adaptation to surface existence. The success of their surface agriculture attracted attention from the wider post-war world, as travelers and traders began to notice the mysterious appearance of productive farms in areas that had previously shown no signs of human habitation. These observers could not understand how crops could suddenly appear in regions they had traveled through regularly, leading to speculation about supernatural causes or hidden technology that enabled agriculture in contaminated soil. The cave dwellers' response to this outside interest reflected their decades of isolation and their continued ambivalence about contact with surface civilization. They maintained their secrecy through careful scheduling of surface activities, working their fields during hours when travelers were unlikely to pass, while retreating to their underground home whenever strangers approached their territory. This policy of concealment enabled them to benefit from surface resources while avoiding the complications that contact with outsiders would inevitably create. But it also limited their ability to trade surplus production for goods and services they could not manufacture in their isolated community. They possessed abundant food but lacked access to medical supplies, advanced technology, and manufactured goods that surface communities might have been willing to exchange for agricultural products. The debate over whether to make contact with outside communities became one of the most significant policy discussions in their post-sealing history, touching fundamental questions about their identity, their relationship to broader human civilization, and their obligations to other survivors of the post-war world. Some argued that their success in surface agriculture created moral obligations to share their knowledge and resources with less fortunate communities, while others maintained that contact with outsiders would compromise the security and independence they had maintained through 4 decades of careful isolation. The stage was set for their next major challenge, as the mysterious productivity of their surface operations began to attract persistent interest from nearby communities, whose own survival depended increasingly on finding new sources of food and agricultural knowledge. The cave dwellers would soon be forced to choose between continued secrecy and the benefits that trade and cooperation might provide, while managing the risks that contact with the outside world would inevitably bring to their unique and vulnerable community. The hunters from Modoc first noticed something unusual on a crisp morning in late spring, when the rising sun illuminated green fields where empty wasteland had stretched for as long as anyone could remember. Thomas Buckner lowered his rifle and rubbed his eyes, certain that exhaustion and hunger were creating mirages in his vision. But the impossible sight remained stubbornly real. Rows of healthy crops growing in soil that radiation monitors had declared barren for over 40 years. His hunting partner, Marcus Webb, stood frozen beside a cluster of barrel cacti, staring at the verdant expanse that seemed to have materialized overnight in the barren landscape they had traversed countless times in their desperate search for game and edible plants. The drought that had plagued their settlement for 3 consecutive seasons had reduced Modoc's food stores to dangerously low levels, forcing hunting parties to venture farther and farther from home in search of sustenance that grew scarcer with each passing month. The farm that spread before them was more than just unexpected. It was miraculous in its abundance and perfection, with irrigation channels that carried clean water through carefully tended fields where corn and wheat grew with a vigor that seemed impossible in the contaminated soil of the post-war world. Livestock grazed in fenced pastures, healthy animals whose sleek coats and well-fed appearance contrasted sharply with the scrawny, mutated creatures that comprised most post-war fauna. But perhaps most mysterious was the complete absence of any human presence, despite obvious signs of careful cultivation and maintenance. The crops showed evidence of recent tending. with weeds pulled and irrigation channels cleared. Yet no workers could be seen anywhere within the farm's boundaries. No smoke rose from chimneys that should have marked farmhouse locations. No sounds of human activity disturbed the peaceful morning air. No signs indicated the presence of the people who must have created this agricultural paradise. The hunters circled the farm's perimeter for over an hour, calling out greetings and searching for any indication of the farmers who had accomplished this miracle of post-war agriculture. Their voices echoed across the fields without response, while their careful examination of the property revealed no footprints, no tools left behind, no evidence that human beings had recently worked the land that showed such obvious signs of human cultivation and care. The mystery deepened as they explored the farm's infrastructure, discovering sophisticated irrigation systems that had been constructed with materials salvaged from pre-war sources but assembled using techniques that seemed far advanced beyond anything typical wasteland communities had achieved. The engineering was elegant and efficient, conserving every drop of precious water while distributing it precisely where growing plants needed it most, creating an oasis of productivity in the midst of drought-stricken wasteland. The return journey to Modoc passed in excited speculation as the hunters debated explanations for their extraordinary discovery, their imaginations producing theories that ranged from hidden vault dwellers to pre-war agricultural robots that had somehow survived the nuclear devastation. But regardless of its mysterious origins, the farm represented hope for their starving community, a potential source of food and agricultural knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and slow death from malnutrition. The town meeting that followed their report was unlike any in Modoc's post-war history, bringing together residents who had begun to abandon hope for their community's survival while facing another season of failed crops and dwindling supplies. The hunters' description of abundant fields and healthy livestock seemed too good to be true, but their reputations for honesty and their obvious excitement suggested that they had indeed discovered something remarkable in the wasteland beyond their struggling settlement. Mayor Cornelius organized an expedition that would attempt to make contact with whoever was responsible for the mysterious farm, hoping to establish trade relationships or at least learn agricultural techniques that might enable Modoc to overcome the drought conditions that had devastated their own farming efforts. The delegation included their best negotiators and their most knowledgeable farmers, people who could recognize quality agriculture while offering fair compensation for assistance or knowledge. The delegation's arrival at the farm was met with the same eerie silence that had greeted the original hunters. Despite calls and signals that should have attracted attention from anyone working within hearing distance, they spent hours exploring the property, examining irrigation systems and crop varieties while searching for clues about the farmers who had created this oasis of productivity in the hostile post-war environment. Their persistence was eventually rewarded with indirect evidence of human presence, fresh footprints near the water sources, tool marks on recently harvested crops, and subtle signs that the property was being actively maintained despite the apparent absence of its caretakers. Someone was definitely responsible for the farm's continued operation, but whoever they were seemed determined to avoid contact with visitors from the outside world. The decision to leave Carl Hansen as a permanent observer reflected Modoc's desperate need to understand and potentially benefit from the mysterious farm, while acknowledging that its owners might eventually reveal themselves if given time and patience rather than persistence and pressure. Carl was selected for this assignment because of his patience, his agricultural knowledge, and his ability to live comfortably in isolation while maintaining careful observation of his surroundings. Carl's first weeks at the farm passed quietly as he established a modest camp at the property's edge, positioning himself where he could observe activities while remaining respectfully outside the boundaries of cultivated land. He maintained scrupulous respect for the property, taking nothing without permission while making his presence obvious enough that the mysterious farmers could approach him if they chose to make contact. The isolation that had initially seemed manageable began to wear on Carl's psychological state as days stretched into weeks without any sign of the people who maintained the miraculous farm. His calls and attempts at communication met with continuing silence, while his careful observations revealed ongoing maintenance activities that seemed to occur at times when he was sleeping or looking in other directions. The first glimpse of the farm's true inhabitants came during Carl's 4th week of observation, when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention during the pre-dawn hours that preceded sunrise. Pale figures moved through the fields with ghostly grace, their luminous appearance creating an impression of supernatural beings rather than ordinary human farmers tending their crops in the early morning darkness. Carl's rational mind initially rejected what his eyes were reporting, dismissing the glowing figures as hallucinations brought on by isolation, poor diet, and the psychological stress of his solitary vigil. But the apparitions appeared night after night with consistent behavior patterns that suggested real intelligence and purpose rather than the random imagery of mental breakdown or sensory deprivation. The figures moved with obvious familiarity through the farm's layout, tending specific crops and performing maintenance tasks with efficiency that spoke of long experience and detailed knowledge. They avoided the areas where Carl had established his observation post, but their activities clearly continued the agricultural work that maintained the property's remarkable productivity. Carl's attempts to approach or communicate with the nocturnal figures met with immediate disappearance, as if the glowing beings could sense his presence and intentions from distances that exceeded normal human perception. They seemed to monitor his movements while remaining beyond the reach of direct contact, maintaining their agricultural activities while ensuring that he never came close enough to confirm their physical reality. The psychological impact of these encounters began to manifest in Carl's behavior and decision-making as the weeks of isolation combined with supernatural experiences that challenged his understanding of reality and possibility. His reports to MODOK became increasingly erratic and fantastic, describing glowing phantoms and spectral farmers who tended crops with otherworldly efficiency while avoiding all contact with ordinary human beings. The reception of Carl's reports in MODOK reflected the community's growing desperation and their corresponding willingness to dismiss evidence that contradicted their hopes for practical assistance from the mysterious farm. They interpreted his accounts of glowing figures as the products of isolation-induced hallucination rather than genuine observations, responding with skepticism and humor rather than serious investigation. The isolation and rejection combined to drive Carl toward the bottle that had provided comfort during previous periods of stress and disappointment in his pre-war life. Alcohol offered temporary escape from the psychological pressure of his impossible assignment while providing liquid courage that enabled him to continue his vigil despite mounting evidence that his mission was doomed to failure. The drinking that began as occasional self-medication gradually evolved into constant inebriation as Carl struggled to cope with experiences that exceeded his ability to process and integrate. The glowing figures continued their nocturnal activities while Carl's capacity for coherent observation deteriorated, creating a feedback loop of psychological stress and substance abuse that undermined both his mental health and his effectiveness as an observer. The escalation of Carl's encounters with the mysterious farmers coincided with his increasing alcohol consumption, creating experiences that seemed increasingly supernatural and threatening as his perception became distorted by fear and intoxication. The pale figures that had initially appeared benign began to seem menacing in his altered consciousness, their glowing appearance suggesting demonic rather than human nature. Carl's final weeks at the farm were characterized by paranoid delusions, that transformed his observation post into a fortress where he cowered behind improvised barricades while watching for supernatural enemies who seemed to grow bolder and more numerous with each passing night. His communications with MODOK ceased entirely as he became convinced that the radio transmitted his location to the ghostly beings who tormented his sleep and haunted his waking hours. The decision to abandon his post came during a particularly intense encounter when Carl became convinced that the glowing figures were preparing to attack his position in overwhelming numbers. His terror overwhelmed whatever remained of his dedication to duty, sending him fleeing through the darkness toward the distant lights of settlements where alcohol and companionship might provide refuge from the supernatural horrors that had consumed his sanity. The journey to the den was accomplished in a haze of panic and desperation, with Carl carrying only the clothes on his back and the bottle that had become his primary source of comfort and courage. He traveled by night to avoid the glowing figures he believed were pursuing him, while using alcohol to suppress the terror that threatened to paralyze him completely whenever he paused to rest. The den welcomed Carl with the indifference that characterized its treatment of all refugees who arrived with stories of loss and failure, providing alcohol and temporary shelter in exchange for whatever possessions or services he could provide. His accounts of glowing phantoms and supernatural farmers were dismissed as the ravings of another broken wasteland wanderer whose mind had been shattered by isolation and hardship. The permanent inebriation that became Carl's refuge in the den erased the specific memories of his encounters at the mysterious farm, while leaving behind only vague impressions of terror and supernatural menace. He became another of the den's permanent residents, sustained by alcohol and occasional odd jobs, while serving as a cautionary example of what the wasteland could do to men who ventured too far from the safety of established communities. Meanwhile, the Slags who had tormented Carl's final weeks through their desperate attempts to frighten him away from their surface operations felt a mixture of relief and guilt over their success in driving off the persistent observer who threatened their security. They had never intended to cause serious psychological harm to the lonely man who watched their farm, but their own terror of discovery had driven them to increasingly dramatic measures. The glowing effect that had so terrified Carl was achieved through careful application of bioluminescent fungi that grew naturally in the deeper chambers of their cave system, organisms that had evolved to create their own light in environments where photosynthesis was impossible. The Slags had learned to cultivate and harvest these fungi, using their luminous properties to create the spectral appearance that would frighten surface dwellers without requiring direct confrontation or violence. The success of their deception exceeded their most optimistic expectations, but it also created new problems. As Carl's disappearance brought investigation teams from MODOK, who were determined to discover what had happened to their missing observer, the Slags realized that their ghostly masquerade had eliminated one threat, only to create another that might prove more dangerous and persistent. The macabre theatrical display that greeted MODOK's search parties represented the Slags' most desperate attempt to permanently discourage interest in their surface operations, using skills learned during their decades of isolation to create convincing evidence of supernatural violence and death. The dummy corpses crafted from Brahmin parts and salvaged clothing were positioned to suggest that Carl and other trespassers had met horrible fates at the hands of the ghostly guardians who protected the mysterious farm. The psychological impact of discovering what appeared to be Carl's mutilated remains, along with other victims crucified and left to rot in the sun, achieved exactly the deterrent effect the Slags had hoped to create. The search party fled in terror, carrying back to MODOK accounts of supernatural violence that would discourage future investigations, while establishing the farm's reputation as a place haunted by vengeful spirits who destroyed anyone who dared trespass on there. domain. The Ghost Farm, as it became known throughout the region, served as an effective barrier that protected the Slags' surface operations, while enabling them to continue their agricultural expansion without interference from outside communities. But their success in creating this fearsome reputation also trapped them within their own deception, making future contact with surface dwellers nearly impossible, while perpetuating their isolation at a time when trade and cooperation might have benefited their growing community. The years that followed the creation of their macabre theatrical display settled into a rhythm of fearful peace that both protected and imprisoned the Slags in equal measure, their success in terrorizing potential trespassers, creating an isolation so complete that it sometimes felt more confining than their original sealed cave system. The Ghost Farm's reputation spread throughout the region, with the inevitable embellishments that accompany supernatural tales, each retelling adding new horrors and miraculous details that transformed their simple deception into regional folklore. Travelers who passed through the area would cross themselves and mutter protective prayers when the mysterious farm came into view, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the vengeful spirits that local legend claimed guarded the cursed fields with supernatural violence. Caravans would alter their routes to avoid passing too close to the boundaries of the haunted property, while individual wanderers would hurry past without stopping, their fear so palpable that it could be sensed by the hidden Slags who watched from concealed positions. The effectiveness of their ghostly masquerade created a protective buffer zone that extended far beyond the actual boundaries of their surface operations, establishing an area of psychological sanctuary where they could work without constant vigilance against discovery. But this same protection came at the cost of complete isolation from the human contact that their growing community increasingly needed, cutting them off from trade opportunities, medical supplies, and the simple social interaction that even their cave-adapted population occasionally craved. The maintenance of their fearsome reputation required constant attention to detail and periodic reinforcement of the supernatural elements that kept potential investigators at bay. The Slags developed elaborate schedules for their spectral appearances, timing their bioluminescent displays to coincide with the movements of distant travelers whose reports would refresh and expand their legend. They learned to read weather patterns and seasonal migration routes, ensuring that their ghostly performances would be witnessed by people who would carry tales of supernatural encounters to settlements throughout the wasteland. The psychological toll of living behind such a terrifying facade gradually began to manifest in the behavior and attitudes of the Slags themselves, particularly among the younger generations who had grown up knowing that their very existence was a secret that must be protected through deception and misdirection. The constant vigilance required to maintain their supernatural disguise created stress patterns that affected their sleep, their relationships, and their ability to enjoy the agricultural abundance they had worked so hard to achieve. The children born during this period of spectral isolation showed signs of social development problems that their community had never previously encountered, growing up with the knowledge that contact with outsiders meant death or enslavement for their people. They played games that involved hiding from imaginary surface dwellers, developed elaborate fantasies about the terrible things that would happen if their existence were discovered, and sometimes woke screaming from nightmares about being dragged away from their underground home by violent strangers. The adults struggled with their own psychological burdens, as the years of maintaining their ghostly deception accumulated emotional weight that none of their previous survival challenges had created. They had adapted successfully to life in sealed caves, overcome their terror of surface conditions, and developed agricultural techniques that enabled them to thrive in the post-war environment. But the necessity of portraying themselves as malevolent spirits whenever outsiders approached created moral conflicts that their community's ethical frameworks were unprepared to address. The bioluminescent fungi that had initially seemed like a miraculous solution to their security needs gradually became a source of physical and psychological problems as prolonged exposure to their chemical compounds created health issues among the slags who regularly applied them to their skin and clothing. The luminous organisms produced toxins that caused rashes, respiratory problems, and neurological symptoms that became more severe with repeated exposure, forcing the community to develop rotation schedules that limited individual contact with their primary defensive resource. The agricultural success that had motivated their surface expansion continued to exceed their most optimistic projections, with crop yields that not only sustained their growing population, but created surpluses that could have supported trade relationships with struggling communities throughout the region. Their techniques for soil remediation and water conservation represented knowledge that could have saved countless lives in settlements that were failing due to drought and contamination. But their reputation as a haunted death trap made sharing this information impossible. The storage facilities they constructed to preserve their abundant harvests became monuments to the paradox of their situation. Vast underground granaries filled with food that could have fed hundreds of people, but which had to remain secret lest their discovery reveal the human intelligence behind the supposedly supernatural farm. They developed preservation techniques that enabled them to maintain food quality for years, while hoping that someday they might find ways to distribute their surplus without compromising their security. The livestock that grazed their surface pastures thrived in ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers, their health and productivity enhanced by the careful breeding programs and veterinary knowledge that the slags had developed during their years of isolation. But these obviously well-cared-for animals also contributed to their supernatural reputation, since such thriving livestock on supposedly haunted land suggested either demonic intervention or the malevolent spirits' need to maintain their earthly domain through ordinary agricultural practices. The irrigation systems that enabled their agricultural success became increasingly sophisticated as slag engineers developed innovations that maximized water efficiency while minimizing the labor required for maintenance and operation. They created networks of channels and reservoirs that could be operated entirely from underground control points, enabling them to maintain their surface crops without exposing themselves to potential observation during daylight hours, when their pale skin and enlarged eyes would immediately reveal their inhuman adaptation. The seasonal rhythms of their surface operations reflected both agricultural necessities and the psychological limitations imposed by their supernatural masquerade, with planting and harvesting activities carefully scheduled to avoid conflicts with their ghostly appearances. They learned to compress agricultural work into brief periods when weather conditions and travel patterns minimized the likelihood of outside observation, while leaving their spectral displays to dominate the longer periods when their fields needed less intensive cultivation. The weather monitoring that became essential to their operations developed into a sophisticated understanding of regional climate patterns that enabled them to predict optimal timing for both agricultural activities and supernatural performances. They tracked wind patterns that would carry the sounds of their ghostly activities to distant travelers, studied cloud formations that would provide dramatic backdrops for their luminescent displays, and learned to use natural atmospheric conditions to enhance the psychological impact of their spectral appearances. The development of underground workshops and manufacturing facilities enabled the slags to produce increasingly elaborate props and effects for their ghostly masquerade, while maintaining the agricultural equipment and infrastructure that supported their surface operations. They became skilled in metalworking and crafts that had no connection to their original cave-dwelling lifestyle, developing capabilities that would have made them valuable trading partners if their existence had not needed to remain secret. The children's education during this period reflected their community's unique position as successful farmers who had to pretend to be supernatural entities combining traditional academic subjects with specialized training in deception, concealment, and the technical aspects of maintaining their ghostly reputation. They learned chemistry through the cultivation of bioluminescent organisms, studied physics through the design of special effects that enhanced their spectral displays, and developed acting skills that enabled them to portray convincing supernatural beings when circumstances required. The religious and spiritual life of their community evolved during this period to incorporate the moral complexities created by their deceptive lifestyle, as traditional ethical frameworks proved inadequate for addressing the questions raised by their systematic campaign of psychological terrorism against innocent travelers. They developed new interpretations of concepts like honesty, harm, and community responsibility that acknowledged the necessity of their deception while maintaining their commitment to fundamental human values. The medical challenges created by their ghostly masquerade extended beyond the direct effects of bioluminescent compounds to include stress-related disorders, sleep disturbances, and psychological conditions that had no precedent in their previous community health experience. Their medical staff developed treatments for anxiety conditions caused by the constant vigilance required to maintain their secret, while addressing physical ailments that resulted from the unconventional chemicals and materials required for their supernatural performances. The social dynamics within their community became increasingly complex as different families and individuals took on specialized roles in maintaining their ghostly reputation, creating hierarchies and dependencies that had not existed during their earlier years of straightforward agricultural development. Some Slags became expert in the technical aspects of special effects and theatrical presentation, while others specialized in intelligence gathering and surveillance that would warn of approaching threats to their security. The romantic relationships and family formation that occurred during this period were complicated by the psychological stress and ethical conflicts inherent in their deceptive lifestyle, as young adults struggled to develop normal emotional connections while participating in activities that required them to portray themselves as malevolent, supernatural beings. Marriages and child-rearing practices had to accommodate the demands of maintaining their community's secret, while preserving the human relationships that gave meaning to their continued survival. The long-term planning that had always characterized Slag leadership became increasingly difficult as their isolation deepened and their supernatural reputation made normal community development almost impossible to envision. They could continue to expand their agricultural operations and improve their underground facilities, but their growth potential was fundamentally limited by the necessity of remaining hidden from the surface world that surrounded their small domain. The psychological impact of watching other communities struggle and fail while possessing knowledge and resources that could provide assistance created moral burdens that weighed heavily on Slag leaders who had been raised to value cooperation and mutual aid. Radio broadcasts occasionally brought news of settlements that were failing due to drought or crop disease, problems that Slag agricultural expertise could have solved. But their commitment to secrecy made intervention impossible. The technological innovations that emerged from their isolation included improvements in food preservation, water purification, and sustainable agriculture that represented significant advances over pre-war knowledge in these areas. But these innovations remained trapped within their community, unable to benefit the broader post-war world because their revelation would compromise the security that their survival still depended upon. The cultural traditions that developed during this period reflected their unique position as a people who had achieved remarkable success while remaining completely hidden from the world they had originally hoped to rejoin. They created art that celebrated both their agricultural achievements and their supernatural masquerade, developing aesthetic sensibilities that found beauty in deception and honor in the sacrifice of normal human social contact for for the sake of community survival. The stories and legends that they told their children during this period portrayed their ghostly activities as heroic rather than deceptive, teaching young Slags that their frightening reputation protected not only themselves but also the ignorant surface dwellers who might otherwise stumble into dangers they were unprepared to handle. These narratives helped children understand their unusual lifestyle, while providing moral frameworks that justified their community's systematic campaign of psychological terrorism. The festivals and celebrations that marked important community events during this period incorporated elements of their supernatural masquerade, alongside traditional agricultural celebrations, creating cultural hybrids that honored both their productive achievements and their defensive necessities. They developed ceremonies that celebrated successful harvests alongside successful deceptions, recognizing both as essential components of their community's survival and prosperity. The gradual recognition that their isolation had become self-perpetuating rather than merely defensive marked the beginning of serious discussions about whether their ghostly masquerade had outlived its usefulness and perhaps become a barrier to their community's continued development. The very success of their deception had created a prison of reputation that might prove more confining than their original sealed caves had ever been. As the 10th year of their surface operations approached, the Slags found themselves confronting the possibility that their supernatural reputation, while protecting them from immediate threats, might be preventing them from achieving the broader integration with post-war civilization that their long-term survival ultimately required. They possessed agricultural knowledge and surplus food that could save lives and build alliances, but their ghostly facade made normal diplomatic contact nearly impossible to achieve safely. The stage was set for a fundamental reassessment of their community's direction and priorities. As leaders who had successfully guided their people through decades of cave dwelling and years of surface agricultural development, now faced the challenge of determining whether their spectral isolation represented permanent security or merely another form of imprisonment that would ultimately prove as limiting as the sealed caves they had worked so hard to escape. The autumn morning that would forever alter the trajectory of Slag civilization dawned with the familiar routine of spectral vigilance and agricultural maintenance, their community leaders monitoring radio frequencies and weather patterns while planning another season of ghostly performances designed to maintain their fearsome reputation. But the figure that appeared on the horizon that crisp October day was unlike any traveler they had observed during their years of supernatural masquerade, a lone wanderer whose approach seemed deliberately methodical rather than accidentally threatening. The stranger wore the distinctive blue jumpsuit of a vault dweller, but his equipment and bearing suggested someone whose experience extended far beyond the sheltered existence typical of underground shelter inhabitants. His movements across the wasteland displayed the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate post-war dangers with skill and determination, while his direct approach toward their haunted domain indicated either ignorance of their reputation or complete indifference to supernatural threats. The Slags' initial response followed their established protocols for deterring unwanted visitors, with their most experienced performers preparing the bioluminescent displays and theatrical effects that had successfully frightened away every previous intruder. But their first attempts to discourage this new arrival met with reactions that suggested they were dealing with someone whose experience with post-war strangeness made their ghostly masquerade seem mundane rather than terrifying. The Vault Dwellers' casual examination of their macabre dummy displays revealed someone who had encountered genuine horror in sufficient quantity to recognize theatrical deception when confronted with it. He studied their carefully arranged Brahmin corpses and crucified scarecrows with the detached interest of an investigator, rather than the terror of a potential victim. His behavior indicating that their supernatural reputation had failed to achieve its intended deterrent effect. The emergency council meeting that convened in the depths of their cave system brought together Slag leaders who had never before faced the failure of their primary defensive strategy, forcing them to confront possibilities they had hoped never to encounter. The strangers' persistence and apparent imperviousness to their ghostly displays suggested that their years of successful isolation might be ending, requiring them to develop new approaches to the challenges of contact with the outside world. Vegir IV, great-grandson of the original patriarch and current leader of their underground civilization, found himself grappling with decisions that exceeded the experience of any previous Slag generation. The community's survival had depended for so long on avoiding exactly this situation that their contingency planning had never seriously addressed the possibility of dealing with someone who could not be frightened away through supernatural theater. The Vault Dwellers' establishment of a permanent camp within sight of their operations forced the Slags to maintain constant surveillance while debating response options that ranged from direct confrontation to complete abandonment of their surface installations. Each alternative carried risks that threatened different aspects of their community's security and prosperity, creating decision-making challenges that tested their consensus-building traditions to their limits. The stranger's daily routines revealed someone who was conducting systematic investigation rather than simply passing through their territory, his activities suggesting that he possessed specific knowledge about their community or objectives that required extended observation of their operations. His camp was positioned to provide optimal surveillance of their surface installations while offering defensive positions that would make direct assault costly and uncertain. The psychological pressure created by constant observation began to affect every aspect of Slag society, as community members who had grown comfortable with their ghostly masquerade found themselves living under scrutiny that made their normal activities feel exposed and vulnerable. The simple act of tending their crops became fraught with anxiety about revelation, while their nighttime spectral performances felt increasingly hollow and ineffective. The breakthrough in their standoff came through the stranger's demonstration of knowledge that should have been impossible for any outsider to possess. His casual references to specific details about their agricultural techniques and community organization, indicating that their isolation had been far less complete than they had believed. His words suggested not just awareness of their existence, but understanding of their history and current circumstances that exceeded anything their security measures should have permitted. The revelation that their mysterious observer was searching not for their community, but for a missing person from Modoc transformed the entire dynamic of their confrontation, replacing supernatural mystery with mundane detective work that required entirely different responses and considerations. The Vault Dwellers' questions about Carl Hansen's disappearance forced the Slags to confront the unintended consequences of their ghostly masquerade while considering whether honesty might serve their interests better than continued deception. The decision to reveal Carl's survival and current location represented the most significant departure from their isolation policies since the original surface emergence, requiring trust in a stranger whose motivations and ultimate intentions remained unclear. But the alternative of continued stonewalling seemed likely to result in more intensive investigation that might ultimately compromise their security more thoroughly than voluntary cooperation. The journey to the den that followed the Vault Dwellers' departure created the first opportunity for direct observation of post-war civilization that any Slag had experienced since their ancestors' sealing, providing shocking insights into the broader world that had developed during their decades of isolation. The settlements, trading posts, and communities that had emerged from the nuclear ashes were both more primitive and more sophisticated than their underground society had anticipated. The discovery of Carl Hansen in his state of permanent inebriation provided confirmation of the Vault Dwellers' story, while forcing the Slags to confront their responsibility for the psychological damage their ghostly performances had inflicted on an innocent observer. Carl's condition served as stark evidence that their supernatural masquerade had consequences extending far beyond the simple deterrent effects they had intended to achieve. The negotiations that followed Carl's recovery required the Slags to engage in their first diplomatic contact with representatives of surface civilization since their ancestors' retreat underground, forcing them to develop communication skills and cultural understanding that their isolation had prevented them from acquiring. The Vault Dweller served as intermediary between their underground society and Modoc's surface community, bridging gaps in experience and expectation that threatened to derail any possibility of peaceful resolution. The revelation of Modoc's desperate situation created moral pressures that challenged the Slags' commitment to continued isolation. As they learned that their fearsome reputation had prevented them from providing assistance to a community whose survival needs their agricultural abundance could have easily satisfied. The knowledge that people were suffering while they maintained surplus food stores created guilt that their previous policy discussions had never been forced to address. The gradual development of trust between the Slag leadership and the Vault Dweller required overcoming decades of conditioning that identified all outsiders as threats to their community's survival, while developing new frameworks for evaluating the risks and benefits of ending their supernatural masquerade. The strangers demonstrated competence and apparent goodwill provided evidence that contact with the surface world might offer opportunities rather than simply dangers. The psychological preparation required for direct contact with Modoc's representatives tested the Slags' adaptation capabilities in ways that their surface emergence had never challenged, forcing them to overcome not just physical sensitivities, but social anxieties that had been reinforced by years of portraying themselves as malevolent supernatural beings. The prospect of normal human interaction seemed almost as terrifying as their first exposure to sunlight had been decades earlier. The careful staging of their first diplomatic contact reflected both their desire for peaceful resolution and their continued concern about maintaining defensive options if negotiations failed, requiring them to balance transparency with security while presenting themselves as potential allies rather than supernatural threats. Their appearance in natural daylight revealed the extent of their physical adaptation, while demonstrating their obviously human nature to observers who had believed the ghost stories for so many years. The shock of Modoc's representatives at discovering that their region's most feared supernatural phenomenon was actually a community of pale but obviously human farmers created psychological disruptions that required careful management to prevent panic or violent reactions. The transformation of their ghostly reputation into human reality forced both communities to reassess assumptions and prejudices that had been reinforced by years of mutual isolation and misunderstanding. The establishment of preliminary trade relationships represented the first economic cooperation between the Slags and surface civilizations since their ancestors' retreat underground, requiring them to develop new systems for valuing and exchanging goods while maintaining security measures that protected their community's essential interests. Their surplus agricultural products provided immediate relief for Modoc's food shortages while demonstrating the mutual benefits that cooperation could provide. The gradual expansion of contact beyond simple trade relationships challenged both communities to develop cultural understanding that bridged the gaps created by their radically different survival experiences. As surface dwellers learned to communicate with people whose social development had been shaped by decades of cave dwelling, while the Slags adapted to interaction with individuals whose psychological patterns had been formed by exposure to post-war surface conditions. The seasonal rhythms of their developing relationship reflected both practical necessities and the psychological limitations that continued to affect slag participation in surface activities, with winter months providing opportunities for more extensive contact, while summer conditions required modifications that accommodated their continued sensitivity to intense sunlight and unlimited spaces. The success of their initial cooperation created pressures for expanded contact that tested the Slags' commitment to gradual integration, while providing evidence that their surface emergence could lead to genuine alliance rather than exploitation or destruction. The demonstration that their community possessed knowledge and resources valuable to surface civilization encouraged them to consider broader participation in post-war recovery efforts. The development of formal agreements that regulated their ongoing relationship with MODOK required both communities to establish legal and diplomatic frameworks for cooperation between societies whose governmental systems and cultural traditions had evolved along completely different paths. Their negotiations created precedents for human communities whose survival needs required them to overcome historical isolation and mutual suspicion. The personal relationships that developed between individual Slags and surface dwellers provided the emotional foundation for their broader diplomatic cooperation, while challenging stereotypes and assumptions that had been created by their years of supernatural reputation. Friendships that crossed the boundaries between underground and surface societies demonstrated the fundamental human connections that could transcend differences in physical appearance and cultural background. The gradual revelation of their full history and capabilities created ongoing adjustments in their relationship with surface communities as the scope of their knowledge and resources became apparent to neighbors who had initially viewed them as simple farmers rather than preservers of pre-war civilization and developers of advanced post-war technologies. Their true significance to regional recovery efforts exceeded anything that their modest surface operations had initially suggested. The establishment of permanent diplomatic and trade relationships marked the end of their isolation, while beginning a new phase of their development that would test their ability to maintain their unique identity while participating fully in the broader post-war world. Their successful transition from supernatural legends to valued allies demonstrated the possibilities for cooperation and mutual assistance that existed within post-war civilization when communities could overcome their fears and prejudices. The long-term implications of their emergence from isolation extended far beyond their immediate region, as news of their success began to spread throughout the post-war world, providing hope and inspiration for other isolated communities, while demonstrating techniques for agricultural recovery and social cooperation that could benefit struggling settlements throughout the wasteland. Their story became evidence that humanity's future could include not just survival but genuine prosperity and community development, even in the harsh conditions of the post-nuclear world. The morning that marked the beginning of the Slags' true integration into surface civilization dawned with ceremonies that celebrated not conquest or submission but the marriage of two communities whose survival had been enhanced through cooperation and mutual understanding. The formal alliance between the underground farmers and the surface settlement of MODOK represented more than simple trade agreements or diplomatic protocols. It embodied the possibility that post-war humanity could overcome the isolation and suspicion that had characterized the early decades of recovery. The first joint harvest that autumn exceeded the most optimistic projections of both communities, with Slag agricultural techniques applied to MODOK's expanded farmlands, producing yields that could sustain not just their combined populations, but significant surplus for trade with other struggling settlements throughout the four. region. The sight of pale cave dwellers working alongside surface farmers in fields that stretched to the horizon marked a transformation that few observers could have imagined during the years when the ghost farm had represented regional terror rather than regional prosperity. The integration process required careful attention to the physical limitations that continued to affect slag workers, even after years of gradual surface adaptation, with work schedules modified to accommodate their sensitivity to intense sunlight, while maximizing their contributions during dawn and dusk hours, when their enhanced vision provided advantages that surface dwellers could not match. The complementary capabilities of both communities created agricultural efficiency that exceeded what either group could have achieved independently. The establishment of mixed residential areas where slags and surface dwellers could live as neighbors rather than separate communities marked a crucial step in overcoming the psychological barriers that had been created by decades of mutual isolation and fear. The construction of partially underground homes that accommodated slag preferences for enclosed spaces while providing surface dwellers with protection from weather and radiation demonstrated architectural innovation that benefited both populations. The children born during this period of integration represented the first generation to grow up with natural contact between cave-adapted and surface-adapted humans, their development providing evidence that the physical and cultural differences between their communities need not create permanent divisions. These young people displayed hybrid characteristics that seemed to combine the best adaptive features of both populations, while avoiding the extreme specializations that had limited their parents' environmental flexibility. The educational systems that emerged from their cooperation preserved the knowledge and cultural traditions of both communities, while developing new curricula that prepared students for life in the integrated society they were creating together. Slag expertise in underground survival and resource conservation, combined with surface knowledge of trade, diplomacy, and regional geography, to provide comprehensive education that exceeded what either community could have offered independently. The technological innovations that resulted from their collaboration addressed challenges that had frustrated both communities during their years of separate development, with slag engineering skills applied to surface infrastructure, while surface manufacturing capabilities enhanced underground systems that had previously been maintained through improvisation and careful repair. Their combined expertise produced improvements in water management, food preservation, and communication that benefited the entire region. The cultural festivals that celebrated their alliance incorporated traditions from both communities, while creating new ceremonies that honored their successful cooperation and mutual assistance during crises that had tested their commitment to integration. These celebrations provided opportunities for social interaction that broke down barriers between populations while reinforcing the shared values and common interests that made their alliance sustainable. The expansion of their agricultural operations to supply food for settlements throughout Northern California transformed their region from a collection of struggling communities into a prosperous agricultural district that attracted traders, settlers, and investment from areas that had previously been too dangerous or impoverished to support economic development. Their success demonstrated that post-war recovery could extend beyond mere survival to achieve genuine prosperity and community growth. The attention their achievements attracted from the growing new California Republic created both opportunities and challenges, as their small, integrated community found itself courted by political and economic forces that operated on scales they had never previously encountered. The NCR's representative spoke of regional integration, standardized governance, and economic development that could transform their successful local cooperation into part of a larger civilization-building project. The debates that preceded their decision to affiliate with the NCR reflected the complexity of maintaining their unique community identity while participating in broader political and economic systems that offered benefits at the cost of autonomy and self-determination. The Slags, in particular, worried that their distinctive culture and adaptive capabilities might be lost in the homogenization that large-scale political integration often produced. The negotiation process that established their relationship with the NCR demonstrated the diplomatic skills that their communities had developed through their successful alliance, enabling them to secure protections for their distinctive characteristics, while contributing their expertise to regional development efforts. Their agreement preserved their agricultural autonomy while providing access to medical technology, manufactured goods, and communication systems that enhanced their quality of life. The infrastructure improvements that accompanied NCR integration transformed their region from an isolated agricultural success story into a connected component of the broader California economy, with roads, communication networks, and standardized currency systems that facilitated trade while reducing the isolation that had characterized their early post-war development. These changes brought obvious benefits while creating cultural pressures that required careful management to preserve community distinctiveness. The first decade of NCR membership demonstrated both the advantages and the costs of integration into larger political systems, with economic prosperity and improved security balanced against bureaucratic requirements and cultural homogenization that gradually eroded some of the unique characteristics that had made their communities distinctive. The Slags found themselves subject to regulations and expectations that had been designed for surface dwellers, while struggling to maintain traditions that were incomprehensible to administrators who had never experienced cave dwelling. The establishment of formal educational systems that met NCR standards required modification of their integrated curricula to emphasize subjects and values that were considered essential for citizenship in the expanding republic, while their own knowledge and cultural traditions were relegated to optional or extracurricular status. The children who grew up under these new educational requirements developed capabilities that enabled them to participate fully in NCR society, while losing some of the distinctive skills and perspectives that had characterized their parents' generation. The economic opportunities that accompanied NCR membership attracted migrants from throughout California who sought employment in their prosperous agricultural district, creating population growth that diluted the distinctive character of their integrated community, while providing labor and expertise that enhanced their productivity. The newcomers brought valuable skills and diverse perspectives, while gradually transforming their region from a unique cooperation between cave dwellers and surface farmers into a typical NCR agricultural district. The military service requirements that accompanied NCR citizenship created particular challenges for young Slags, whose physical adaptations made them unsuitable for standard military training, while providing unique capabilities that could have been valuable in specialized roles. The accommodation of their distinctive needs required negotiations that established precedents for managing diversity within NCR forces, while ensuring that their communities could fulfill their civic obligations. The taxation systems that funded NCR services and infrastructure placed financial burdens on their communities that had previously operated through informal cooperation and resource sharing, requiring them to develop cash-based economic systems that replaced their traditional approaches to resource allocation and community support. The transformation from subsistence and barter to market-based economics changed fundamental aspects of their social relationships, while providing access to goods and services that enhanced their material prosperity. The legal systems that governed their region under NCR authority replaced their traditional consensus-based decision-making with formal courts and standardized procedures that provided more consistent justice while reducing their community's autonomy in managing internal affairs. The Slags, in particular, struggled with legal concepts that had been developed for surface societies while having little relevance to their distinctive circumstances and needs. The communication networks that connected their region to the broader NCR provided access to information and cultural resources that had been unavailable during their years of isolation, but also exposed their communities to influences and pressures that challenged traditional values and practices. Radio broadcasts and printed materials brought news of the wider world while promoting lifestyles and aspirations that were often incompatible with their resource conservation and community cooperation traditions. The medical services that became available through NCR integration provided treatments for diseases and conditions that had previously been managed through traditional remedies and community support, while also exposing their population to diseases and health challenges that their isolation had previously prevented. The improved medical care enhanced their life expectancy and quality of life, while creating dependencies on systems and resources that were controlled by external authorities. The second decade of NCR membership saw the gradual erosion of many distinctive characteristics that had made their communities unique, as standardization and integration pressures encouraged conformity with broader NCR cultural norms, while discouraging practices and traditions that were considered archaic or inefficient. The Slags found their cave-dwelling traditions increasingly impractical as their children pursued education and careers that required participation in surface society. The physical changes that occurred in the Slag population during this period reflected both natural adaptation to increased surface activity and conscious choices by individuals who sought to reduce the visible signs of their distinctive heritage. Cosmetic treatments that darkened their pale skin and surgical procedures that reduced their enlarged pupils became common as young Slags attempted to blend more completely into NCR society while avoiding the discrimination and curiosity that their distinctive appearance often attracted. The cultural assimilation that accompanied these physical changes represented the gradual abandonment of traditions and practices that had sustained their community through decades of isolation and adaptation. As cave-dwelling customs were replaced by surface lifestyle preferences, while distinctive knowledge and skills were forgotten in favor of standardized education and employment opportunities, the underground workshops and living spaces that had once been central to their identity became historical curiosities rather than living cultural traditions. The intermarriage between Slags and surface dwellers that increased throughout this period produced children whose mixed heritage made them fully integrated members of NCR society, while diluting the distinctive characteristics that had defined their ancestral communities. These young people possessed neither the extreme cave adaptations of their Slag grandparents, nor the surface specializations of their other heritage, creating a generation that was perfectly suited for life in integrated NCR communities while lacking the unique capabilities that had made their ancestors valuable. The economic success that their region achieved under NCR governance provided prosperity that exceeded anything their isolated communities could have imagined. With standardized currency, regulated markets, and guaranteed property rights, creating wealth and security that enhanced their material quality of life, while reducing their dependence on community cooperation and resource sharing. The individual prosperity that accompanied NCR integration made traditional community obligations seem burdensome rather than essential for survival. The technological improvements that accompanied their integration into NCR infrastructure eliminated many of the resource constraints that had shaped their community's development, providing abundant clean water, reliable electricity, and manufactured goods that made their traditional conservation and recycling practices seem unnecessary rather than essential. The abundance that NCR membership provided reduced their appreciation for the skills and knowledge that had enabled their ancestors' survival during periods of scarcity and isolation. The third decade of NCR membership completed the transformation of their region from a unique cooperation between distinctive communities into a prosperous but typical agricultural district that differed little from other successful farming areas throughout California. The Ghost Farm became simply another NCR agricultural facility, while the caves that had sheltered generations of Slags became historical sites rather than living communities. The success of their integration into NCR society demonstrated both the benefits and the costs of abandoning isolation in favor of participation in broader civilization, with material prosperity and security balanced against the loss of distinctive identity and cultural uniqueness that had made their communities remarkable examples of human adaptation and cooperation. Their transformation from mysterious cave dwellers into ordinary NCR citizens marked the end of one chapter in human post-war development, while beginning another that would be defined by different challenges and opportunities. The morning light that filtered through the windows of what had once been called the Ghost Farm revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition from the mysterious agricultural miracle that had terrified travelers for so many years. The fields stretched in orderly rows marked by standardized NCR survey stakes, their productivity measured in quarterly reports rather than whispered legends, while the workers who tended them showed no trace of the pale, ethereal figures who had once glowed with bioluminescent fungi in the pre-dawn darkness. The third generation of Slags, born under NCR governance, displayed none of the distinctive physical characteristics that had marked their grandparents as children of the deep earth. Their skin tanned to normal human coloration through decades of unrestricted surface activity, while their eyes had adapted to natural lighting conditions until their pupils showed no sign of the extreme enlargement that had once been their species-defining trait. These young people moved through sunlight with the casual confidence of surface dwellers, their bodies showing no memory of ancestors who had cowered from the burning sky. The caves that had sheltered their community for over 60 years stood empty except for occasional tours conducted by NCR historical societies seeking to preserve the memory of California's unique post-war adaptations. The passages that had once echoed with children's laughter and the quiet conversations of families adapting to underground life now carried only the voices of visitors, marveling at the primitive conditions their ancestors had endured before the benefits of NCR civilization had lifted them from their subterranean existence. The hydroponic gardens that had sustained generations of cave dwellers were preserved as museum exhibits demonstrating the ingenuity of isolated communities, their growing chambers maintained by automated systems that eliminated the careful tending that had once provided meaningful work for young Slags learning the skills of underground survival. The technology that had enabled their ancestors' independence was now reduced to historical curiosity rather than living knowledge that might prove essential for future survival. The underground lake that had provided clean water for their sealed community became a recreational swimming pool for NCR citizens who appreciated the novelty of swimming in natural caves without understanding the spiritual significance the water had once held for people whose survival depended absolutely on its continued flow. The sacred spring that had sustained their community through decades of isolation was transformed into a tourist attraction that generated revenue for the regional economy. The bioluminescent fungi that had provided both lighting and defensive camouflage during their years of spectral masquerade were cultivated in NCR laboratories for commercial applications, their natural properties exploited for industrial purposes, while their role in protecting a vulnerable community was forgotten. The organisms that had once enabled desperate people to portray themselves as supernatural guardians became ingredients in cosmetics and entertainment products that bore no connection to their original defensive necessity. The engineering innovations that had enabled their surface agriculture were incorporated into standard NCR farming manuals without attribution to their slag inventors, their techniques becoming routine practice throughout California, while the distinctive knowledge and cultural context that had produced them disappeared from memory. The irrigation systems and soil remediation methods that had transformed wasteland into productive farmland were treated as inevitable technological progress rather than the desperate innovations of isolated people fighting for survival. The children who attended NCR schools in the region learned about their area's agricultural productivity and economic importance. Without understanding the unique history that had created their prosperous community, their education focused on standard California history rather than the extraordinary story of cave adaptation and surface emergence that had shaped their homeland. The remarkable tale of human adaptation and community cooperation became footnotes in textbooks rather than living cultural memory. The residential areas that had once been carefully designed to accommodate both cave-dwelling and surface-dwelling populations were renovated according to standard NCR architectural principles, their unique features eliminated in favor of conventional layouts that maximize property values, while ignoring the specific needs of people whose psychology had been shaped by decades of enclosed living. The hybrid spaces that had enabled successful integration were replaced by standard suburban developments, indistinguishable from those found throughout the Republic. The seasonal rhythms that had governed slag agricultural activities for decades were abandoned in favor of year-round production schedules that maximized economic efficiency while eliminating the cultural significance that planting and harvesting had once held for people whose survival depended on successful crop cycles. The spiritual connections between their community and the agricultural processes that sustained them were severed in favor of purely commercial relationships with the land. The medical knowledge that had enabled their community's successful adaptation to both underground and surface environments was incorporated into NCR public health systems without recognition of its unique origins or the extraordinary circumstances that had necessitated its development. The treatments for radiation exposure, dietary deficiencies, and psychological conditions caused by extreme isolation became routine medical procedures rather than hard-won expertise, developed by people facing unprecedented survival challenges. The consensus-based decision-making that had enabled their community to navigate complex choices about surface emergence and outside contact was replaced by standard NCR democratic processes that provided individual voting rights, while eliminating the intensive discussion and community-wide agreement that had characterized their traditional governance. The social technologies that had maintained harmony in crowded underground conditions were abandoned in favor of legal systems designed for surface societies with abundant space and resources. The resource conservation practices that had enabled their survival in enclosed systems were abandoned as unnecessary restrictions on individual consumption, with NCR abundance making their careful recycling and waste management seem obsessive rather than essential. The skills that had enabled them to survive indefinitely on limited resources were forgotten as their descendants learned to take abundance for granted, while losing the knowledge that might prove essential during future scarcity. The artisanal crafts that had developed during their isolation were replaced by manufactured goods available through NCR commercial networks, eliminating both the skills and the cultural significance of creating useful objects through individual creativity and community knowledge. The workshops where generations of Slags had learned to make tools, furniture, and art from salvaged materials stood empty, as their descendants purchased mass-produced alternatives that lacked personal meaning or cultural connection. The oral traditions that had preserved their history and cultural values through decades of isolation were displaced by NCR educational curricula and entertainment media that provided standardized cultural content while ignoring the unique experiences and wisdom of their community. The stories that had taught children about survival, cooperation, and adaptation were forgotten as irrelevant to life in an abundant society that had solved the problems their ancestors had faced. The language innovations that had developed during their cave-dwelling years disappeared as their descendants adopted standard English without the specialized vocabulary that had been created to describe underground experiences and sensations. The words that had captured subtle distinctions in darkness, texture, and spatial relationships were lost, along with the experiences that had necessitated their creation, leaving their descendants unable to describe or understand aspects of their heritage. The religious and spiritual practices that had sustained their community through the psychological challenges of isolation and adaptation were abandoned in favor of standard NCR religious institutions that provided social connection, while tame, lacking the specific relevance that their traditional beliefs had held for people facing unique survival circumstances. The ceremonies that had marked important community transitions were replaced by conventional celebrations that acknowledged individual achievements rather than community survival and cooperation. The physical modifications that some Slags had undergone to blend more successfully into NCR society became permanent changes that were passed on to their children, eliminating the visible signs of their distinctive heritage, while ensuring that future generations would show no trace of their ancestors' remarkable adaptation to underground life. The surgical and cosmetic procedures that had been chosen to reduce discrimination became irreversible transformations that erased their genetic legacy. The marriage patterns that had once been carefully managed to maintain community harmony in crowded conditions evolved into standard NCR romantic relationships based on individual choice rather than community needs, creating family structures that prioritized personal fulfillment over group survival, while eliminating the social bonds that had sustained their ancestors through decades of shared challenges. The fourth decade of NCR membership completed the transformation of their community from a unique example of human adaptation into a typical California agricultural district whose residents showed no sign of their extraordinary heritage. Their success in integration measured by the complete elimination of the distinctive characteristics that had once made them remarkable. The census records that documented their population made no distinction between descendants of cave dwellers and other NCR citizens, treating their complete assimilation as evidence of successful social policy. The ghost farm designation was removed from official maps as the supernatural legends that had once protected their community became embarrassing folklore that contradicted the rational, scientific worldview promoted by NCR education and governance. The stories that had once served essential defensive purposes were dismissed as primitive superstition that had no place in modern civilization, their protective function forgotten along with the vulnerable people they had once sheltered. The historical markers that acknowledged their region's unique past focused on its economic contribution to NCR development rather than the extraordinary human story of adaptation and survival that had created their agricultural success. The plaques that commemorated their achievements celebrated productivity and integration, while ignoring the courage and ingenuity that had enabled their ancestors to survive and thrive in impossible circumstances. The final erasure of their distinctive identity was completed not through violence or oppression, but through the gentle pressure of success and prosperity that made their ancestors' struggles seem irrelevant to descendants who had never experienced scarcity, isolation, or the necessity of depending entirely on community cooperation for survival. The abundance that NCR membership provided eliminated both the need for their traditional skills and the understanding of why those skills had once been essential. The transformation from mysterious cave dwellers to invisible citizens represented the ultimate success of their integration into broader civilization, but also the complete loss of the unique knowledge, abilities, and perspectives that had made their community a remarkable example of human adaptability and cooperation. Their descendants achieved everything their ancestors had hoped for in terms of security and prosperity, while losing everything that had made their ancestors' achievements remarkable and meaningful. The empty caves that had once sheltered a thriving underground civilization stood as monuments to a form of human existence that had proven both possible and ultimately temporary, their chambers echoing with memories of voices that would never again speak the distinctive language of people who had learned to find safety in stone walls and meaning in the careful conservation of precious resources. The Slags had succeeded so completely in their integration that they had ceased to exist as a distinctive people, their story preserved only in historical records that few bothered to read and fewer still truly understood. The morning census takers who walked through what had once been the most mysterious agricultural region in Northern California found nothing in their systematic documentation that would suggest the area had ever been home to anything more remarkable than particularly successful farming techniques and unusually productive soil conditions. Their clipboards recorded standard demographic information about families whose surnames meant nothing to officials who had never heard the whispered stories about glowing figures and supernatural guardians, while their measurements of property boundaries encompassed land that had once been defended by theatrical displays of corpses and crucified scarecrows. The irrigation channels that still carried water through the expanded agricultural district bore no plaques or markers, indicating that their original design had emerged from the desperate ingenuity of people who had learned water conservation through decades of dependence on a single underground lake. The engineering principles that had enabled their ancestors to transform contaminated wasteland into productive farmland were embedded in concrete and steel systems that functioned automatically, their origins forgotten by the technicians who maintained them according to standard NCR procedures. The soil composition reports filed annually with regional agricultural authorities documented mineral content and contamination levels that reflected 40 years of careful remediation work. But these scientific measurements contain no reference to the traditional knowledge that had enabled isolated cave dwellers to identify and treat specific types of radiation damage through patient experimentation and accumulated wisdom. The techniques that had transformed poisoned earth into fertile ground were reduced to chemical formulas rather than remembered as hard-won victories over post-war environmental devastation. The seed varieties that continued to thrive in the region's climate included hybrids that had been developed during the years of underground cultivation, plant species that had been carefully bred to maximize nutrition, while minimizing resource requirements during periods when every calorie and every drop of water had to be conserved for community survival. These botanical achievements were catalogued in NCR agricultural databases as routine crop improvements rather than recognized as innovations that had enabled human survival under impossible circumstances. The community centers that served the region's current population occupied buildings whose architectural features reflected design principles that had emerged from the necessity of accommodating both cave-dwelling surface-dwelling residents during the critical years of integration and adaptation. The meeting halls and recreational facilities included spaces that could be completely enclosed and darkened, architectural elements that served no obvious purpose for their current users, but which had once provided psychological comfort for people whose nervous systems had been shaped by decades of underground living. The medical facilities that provided healthcare for the region's residents maintained specialized equipment and treatment protocols that had originally been developed to address the unique health challenges faced by people whose bodies had been adapted to cave environments while learning to function in surface conditions. The radiation monitoring systems, vitamin supplementation programs, and psychological counseling services reflected institutional knowledge about managing the transition from underground to surface living, even though their original purposes were no longer recognized by current practitioners. The schools that educated the region's children included in their science curricula lessons about hydroponics, mushroom cultivation, and closed-system resource management that had originated from the survival necessities of their cave-dwelling ancestors, but were now taught as general agricultural knowledge without reference to their extraordinary origins. The techniques that had once meant the difference between life and death for isolated communities were transmitted to new generations as routine academic subjects rather than essential survival skills. The libraries that served the expanded community contained comprehensive collections of technical manuals, historical documents, and cultural materials that had been accumulated during the decades of isolation but were now shelved alongside standard NCR educational resources without special recognition of their unique provenance. The knowledge that had enabled human adaptation to seemingly impossible circumstances was available to anyone interested enough to search for it, but few contemporary residents understood the significance of information that had once been literally matters of life and death. The economic records that documented the region's prosperity included references to agricultural productivity rates that exceeded standard NCR averages, statistical achievements that reflected the application of conservation and efficiency principles developed during years when waste meant death and careful resource management enabled survival. The financial success that had made their region attractive to NCR investment and development was built on foundations of knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of desperate innovation. The transportation networks that connected their area to the broader California economy followed routes that had been established during the early years of contact with outside communities, pathways that reflected the cautious expansion from underground safety to surface commerce that had characterized their gradual emergence from isolation. The roads and communication lines that enabled their current prosperity were built along corridors that had once been carefully scouted by pale figures moving through darkness to avoid detection by potential threats. The water treatment facilities that provided clean drinking water to thousands of residents utilized purification techniques that had been refined during the years, when every drop had to be recycled and reused in closed underground systems, where contamination could have killed entire communities. The technology that now provided abundance had been developed through scarcity, its efficiency principles emerging from circumstances where waste was not just impractical, but literally fatal. The waste management systems that handled the region's increasing population incorporated recycling and conservation principles that reflected traditional slag approaches to resource utilization, though these efficient practices were now motivated by economic considerations rather than survival necessities. The techniques that had enabled indefinite sustainability in closed systems continued to benefit communities that no longer understood the desperate circumstances that had necessitated their development. The emergency preparedness protocols that were maintained by regional authorities included procedures for food storage, water conservation, and community organization that bore striking similarities to the survival systems that had sustained cave-dwelling communities through decades of isolation. The contingency plans that prepared current residents for potential disasters incorporated wisdom that had been learned through actual experience of civilizational collapse and recovery. The cultural festivals that celebrated the region's agricultural success included traditional foods and preparation techniques that had originated during the underground years, but were now presented as regional cuisine rather than survival adaptations. The recipes that had maximized nutrition while conserving scarce ingredients were served at community gatherings where their origins as desperate innovations were forgotten in favor of their current status as local culinary traditions. The craft traditions that were maintained by hobbyist groups included woodworking, metalworking, and textile production techniques that had been essential skills during the years of isolation, but were now pursued as recreational activities by people who had never experienced the necessity that had originally motivated their people. Development. The workshops that had once produced tools and materials essential for community survival were transformed into leisure activities that preserved traditional knowledge without understanding its original significance. The architectural styles that characterized newer construction in the region reflected design principles that had emerged from the need to accommodate people whose psychological development had been shaped by enclosed spaces, though these features were now chosen for aesthetic reasons rather than therapeutic necessity. The buildings that provided comfort for cave-adapted residents had evolved into regional architectural traditions that were admired for their uniqueness without understanding their functional origins. The storytelling traditions that were preserved by local historical societies included simplified versions of their community's extraordinary history, tales that had been sanitized and romanticized until they bore little resemblance to the desperate struggles and remarkable achievements that had actually characterized their ancestors' experience. The legends that had once served as cultural instruction for survival became entertainment that obscured, rather than preserved, the lessons their ancestors had learned through hardship and adaptation. The scientific research that was conducted in regional universities included studies of human adaptation, community resilience, and sustainable agriculture that drew on data collected during their community's unique development, but failed to recognize the extraordinary circumstances that had made such adaptation necessary. The academic papers that analyzed their achievements treated them as routine examples of human flexibility rather than remarkable demonstrations of species survival capability under extreme conditions. The technological innovations that continued to emerge from the region reflected problem-solving approaches that had been developed during the years when every challenge required creative solutions using limited resources, though these innovative tendencies were now attributed to regional culture rather than survival necessity. The engineering excellence that characterized local industry was built on foundations of desperate ingenuity that had been learned when failure meant death rather than mere inconvenience. The environmental conservation practices that were maintained throughout the region reflected attitudes toward resource use that had been shaped by decades of absolute dependence on careful stewardship of limited supplies, though these practices were now motivated by environmental consciousness rather than survival requirements. The ecological wisdom that had enabled indefinite sustainability in closed systems continued to benefit communities that no longer remembered why such careful conservation had once been essential. The social cooperation patterns that characterized community organization throughout the region showed traces of the consensus building and mutual support systems that had enabled crowded underground communities to maintain harmony during decades of stressful conditions. Though these cooperative tendencies were now attributed to regional culture rather than survival adaptation, The social technologies that had prevented conflict in impossible circumstances continued to benefit communities that faced only ordinary challenges. The resilience that characterized the region's response to economic downturns, natural disasters, and other challenges reflected psychological and organizational strengths that had been developed during decades when survival required the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances while maintaining community cohesion. The crisis management capabilities that impressed NCR administrators were built on foundations of experience with genuine existential threats that had tested every aspect of human adaptability. The legacy that remained most visible in the daily life of their descendants was not the dramatic story of cave adaptation and surface emergence, but the quiet competence and community cooperation that continued to characterize their region. Decades after the original necessity for such behaviors had been eliminated by NCR prosperity and security, the values and capabilities that had enabled extraordinary survival became the foundation for ordinary excellence that distinguished their communities without revealing the remarkable history that had shaped their development. The memory that persisted in the landscape itself carried traces of their extraordinary story in the form of empty caves that had once sheltered thriving communities, abandoned irrigation systems that had been engineered with desperate precision, and soil compositions that reflected years of careful remediation work by people who understood that their survival depended absolutely on the successful transformation of poisoned earth into productive farmland. The physical evidence of their achievements remained embedded in the geography, even as human memory of their significance faded into historical obscurity. And so we reach the end of our journey through the forgotten depths of human adaptation, where children of darkness learn to embrace the light, while teaching us that transformation need not mean destruction of what came before. The Slags remind us that survival often requires becoming something new while honoring something old, that communities can evolve beyond recognition while preserving the essential wisdom that enabled their existence in the first place. Their story whispers through empty caves and productive fields, in irrigation channels that still carry water with impossible efficiency and soil that remembers the patient hands that healed it from radiation's poison. They chose integration over isolation, growth over stagnation, hope over fear, and in doing so became invisible not through failure, but through the most profound success. The peaceful transformation from legendary beings into ordinary people whose extraordinary origins live on in the quiet competence of their descendants. Rest now, fellow wanderer, and dream of underground sanctuaries where communities learn to thrive in impossible darkness before emerging to share their light with a world that desperately needed their wisdom. Let their gentle disappearance into normalcy comfort you with the knowledge that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones, achieved not through conquest, but through patient adaptation and the courage to trust in tomorrow's possibilities. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the wasteland, the legacy of those who chose cooperation over conflict continues to nourish the world with abundance born from scarcity, hope harvested from despair,